October 1994. Final Fantasy VI had just launched in the United States. I was sitting on the floor watching my oldest brother play through the game with the sounds of Metallica's Black Album pumping out of the 4 CD changer stereo that every 90s kid had. The game's boss, Kefka, had just won. The world was falling into ruin, and the floating continent was about to plummet into the world below. My brother's party was ready to jump to safety on Setzer's airship, the Blackjack, waiting as the countdown on the screen got closer and closer to 0. He pressed the jump button, and I screamed, "Wait!" But it was too late. He didn't wait for Shadow. And now that character never has a chance to join his party for the final fight. To this day, I still haven't forgiven my brother, and that is a 100% true story. But that moment served as a pivotal point in my understanding of RPG. One, that Final Fantasy VI is the best of the entire series, and arguably one of my favorite RPGs. But most importantly, that even games could have dire consequences. Maybe this is what awoke that sadistic nature of grinding my face off against an endless tirade of deaths, but this marks the moment that I knew RPGs, or role-playing games if you somehow don't know, were my favorite genre. But the genre has changed, and with it have some of the methods of playing. Gone are the days of your party lining up to square off against some foe as a static timer ticks away, readying your next adventurer to attack. The heyday of isometric RPGs ruling as kings of the computer gaming circuit have all passed into myth and legend, with the occasional monument to their former glory erected by companies such as Larian or Obsidian. Now, RPGs, more often than not, have become a feature attached to multiple games, and the purity of the genre exists as a hybrid across many, which also is a conversation for another time. But RPGs live on in a far more grueling yet intoxicating fashion. The Soulsborne series, and the newly created Souls-like subgenre. In this video today, I want to discuss how I truly believe that Souls-like are the superior RPGs in this era, and how we can see their impressions left across almost every major game release in the last decade and a half since Demon's Souls' release in 2009. So join me in this adventure as we go into a bit of history, talk about what makes this genre so successful, how they ultimately make you a better gamer, and how their influence has spread beyond just simply RPGs and action-adventure games. Let's get started on, is Souls-like the superior RPG of today? Before we get into the history of the Souls series and everything else I'm going to talk about, I think we should establish what a Souls-like actually is. In the last decade or so, we've seen a growing trend in gaming publication to constantly award labels as a descriptor. This is applied to the many games that come out from both indie and AAA dev houses. It used to be used sparingly, but now you will see games described as a roguelike, Metroidvania, Souls-like game, which is just the most convoluted way of saying procedurally generated side-scroller. This is akin to people using bullshit terms like elder emo to describe someone who listens to emo music and isn't 14. Fuck you, I'll listen to Pierce the Veil for as long as I want and bring up the cancellation of Vans Warped Tour as the end of a fucking era. Either way though, Souls-like is a term applied to any game that has similar threads to the legacy of From Software games, starting with Demon's Souls onward. This is also sometimes referred to as the Soulsborne series, combining Bloodborne in with the other 4 Souls titles. This was a preface I wanted to make up front in case you weren't 100% sure what Souls-like was, and it's something I'll expand upon more as we go through this video, but let's get into some history. Just like the intro to this video, we'll step back to 1994. This is a time when the Super Nintendo is pumping out a lot of amazing titles that create a legacy of lasting nostalgia and gaming influence. But it's also the time that the first PlayStation launched in Japan on December 3rd. 2 or so weeks later, a little-known company that was responsible for making business software put out their first game, Kingsfield by From Software. It was a first-person dark fantasy game with a crunchy and grueling difficulty curve that punished the player more than rewarded them. Sound familiar at all? This was the beginning of a very long road for From Software. The game launched to an initially polarizing critical reception. It was either hated or adored due to the game having such a rough learning curve. But eventually, gaming publications and word of mouth bolstered the game's reception, resulting in an overall commercial success, paving the way for not just a second release, but a total of 4 games in the series, each one improving upon the game's structure and adding to it. Some of the early hallmarks of the Soul series started to take shape in games such as Kingsfield, a steep learning curve, dark fantasy themes, and intense dungeon crawls. Unfortunately, Kingsfield never took off in the West, despite every entry after the first coming overseas. At the time it landed, 1993 to 1996 were filled with some of the most iconic RPGs of the time. Earthbound, Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG, Final Fantasy VI, the list goes on. And Kingsfield drowned amidst a sea of excellent titles. Also, localization and pricing were two major factors as well, with most Japanese imports having either high prices or coming with a translation guide. Now, we have companies or wings of existing companies that do this, but in the 90s, localizing RPGs, games with screeds of text, was too expensive to be worth it for most studios. From Software also created an offshoot of sorts to the Kingsfield series called Shadow Tower, with an almost identical overall feel to the parent series. There is one very important change though. Shadow Tower is the game that introduced a leveling method like the Soul system we have today. Enemies respawn endlessly, and you use the currency of souls given upon their deaths to upgrade and level your character. Unlike Kingsfield though, Shadow Tower did not have a great reception, and it is often overlooked in the hierarchy of contributions that From Software has made to the gaming industry. But as we march closer and closer to a fateful day in 2009, From Software released other major games such as Armored Core, and some other minor titles you probably forgot about: Evergrace, Ninja Blade, Chrome Hounds, Another Century's Episode, and the ever-cult classic, The Adventures of Cookies and Cream, which is a game I was floored to know existed, let alone developed by From Software. Another game in the company's repertoire was the Otogi series, taking that dark fantasy theme of Kingsfield and Shadow Tower, but giving it the flair of feudal Japan and Japanese mythology. Otogi is important to the history of the Soul series because the themes are almost identical. You play as an imperial assassin that was saved by a princess, kept in a state of undeath where he must constantly pilfer evil souls for magic points lest he fade into nothing. Even the opening of the game is similar. A calamity has fallen upon the kingdom, resulting in the veil between the living and the supernatural falling, allowing demons to prowl the world. Everyone that wasn't initially killed by the event was corrupted, serving the demons. I mean, call the princess the Lady in Black, and you basically have the start of Demon Souls right there. Unfortunately, neither of the Otogi games did well enough despite their critical reception being pretty solid. Personally, I loved the games. They were very different for the time, and we weren't necessarily flooded in the Western market with promising samurai games. It was one of the first games I bought for my PS2 after purchasing Devil May Cry. Either way, Demon Souls launched in October 2009, 1 month after the launch of the PS3 Slim, and the two were often bundled together to give Western markets their first dose of the Souls series. Demon Souls had launched earlier that year in Japan to critical success, something that was mirrored in the States, scoring no lower than an 8 out of 10. To be fair, that was from official US PlayStation Magazine, who also gave a 100% to the not-so-well-received Italian Job game influenced by the hit Mark Wahlberg movie, where he drives Mini Coopes through LA traffic while Edward Norton chases him in a helicopter with a pencil fucking mustache. So take that 8 out of 10 with a grain of salt. Demon Souls also had something very unique for its time. It was a conventional Western dark fantasy game. Most games at the time were not scoring well on PS3, and this was one of the first ones that stood out as a very easily identifiable knights in shining armor type of game, something that the game turns on its head as you fight through an unconventional game with unconventional monsters. Ultimately, Demon Souls opened a door to a game where you either hated it and didn't understand why anyone would play this game in the first place, or fell in love with the absolute massive effort it took to beat that game at the time. You had to get better to play this game, and it wasn't like previous RPGs where you simply had to grind, but you had to learn timing, attack patterns, hitboxes, and all these things that were somewhat foreign to the genre. A lot of the methods of playing Demon Souls were reminiscent of fighting games as far as worrying about your reaction time, learning an enemy's combos, utilizing iframes, all these terms that even saying them out loud, I don't even know what they mean. But if you've heard the term iframes, it's referring to the animation frames of invincibility you have from specific actions in the game, like being locked into a character's finishing animation or pairing animation, and so on and so forth. But Demon Souls was only the start. Companies weren't bursting at the seams to turn the difficulty meter on their games to max just yet, because you have to understand the gaming landscape at the time was big. Modern Warfare, Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, Uncharted, all these games came out in 2007, with their second iterations coming out in 2009 or 2010. If you wanted to make any kind of action RPG, you're going to make some sort of God of War inspired game, like Castlevania Lord of Shadows or Darksiders 1, which came out the same year as God of War 3. all in 2010. The industry was moving towards large AAA studio releases with Hollywood-level budgets, voice acting chops, and narratives. Most importantly, they were easy. Or if not easy, they weren't challenging enough to make you second guess why you started playing video games in the first place. Demon's Souls was a hard left turn. It had near none of these aspects, especially when it came to voice acting or narrative. Arguably, one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire Soulsborne series is not their difficulty, but their lore, which is fed to you in the same fashion as piecing together a drunken vagrant's life story at a bus stop. Moreover, Demon's Souls was a PlayStation exclusive, and although PS3 didn't win the console war of that generation, it had a laundry list of strong exclusive games that created a die-hard following. With this exclusivity, From Software's desire to branch into both PC and Xbox led to the development of Dark Souls. Sony, owning the Demon's Souls IP, kept that game firmly in their clutches, but that gave the game's director of Dark Souls a chance to spread his wings and expand upon a lot of the themes created in the first entry. That director was Hidetaka Miyazaki, and he would go on to direct almost every major launch under the Soulsborne series in the coming decade, even being elevated to president of From Software sometime in 2014. Dark Souls was the beginning of a hard ramp, expanding the genre now onto the Xbox 360, the middle child of the 7th generation gaming consoles, attributing for something like 35% market share, nearly doubling PS3's total units sold. This exposure was the powder keg for the franchise and the company as a whole. To put into perspective, 2 years after Demon's Souls' release, the game had sold a little over 500,000 units. Dark Souls had sold 2.3 million units in the same time frame, a number that would rise with each subsequent launch. Miyazaki personally helmed Bloodborne, Sony's chance at grasping some of the Souls-like success a year after Dark Souls' release. Bloodborne was developed in tandem with Dark Souls 2, with Miyazaki giving guidance but focusing on Bloodborne as he was that game's set director. He returned to direct the next 3 major titles: Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, and of course, Elden RIng. From the obscure success of Kingsfield to the rampant global fame of Elden RIng, From Software has given us titles that are enchanting and frustrating all in the same measure. It's a company that has unified us under one banner, all driven towards the biggest reward one can get from completing any title in the Souls catalog: accomplishment. This badge is what makes the series so popular and why it has influenced so many games since. Seeing the credits roll in a game you've just spent hours beating is one of the most gratifying feelings any gamer can receive. Toiling endlessly to accomplish some of the hardest games or weaving the tapestry of an intricate narrative across multiple characters is the true rub of video games. This is no less true with the Souls-like genre. How many of us have spent hours or even days on a single boss, dying every time we get them near zero? Then something happens. You enter the Matrix. You can see their moves before they happen, and you do it. You finally defeat them. That moment of leaping out of your seat and punching the wind, followed by a not so glorious sounding yelp of triumph, is a high we all chase every time we sit down to game. You probably got that feeling trying to defeat, one of the swamp rats in Demon's Souls. But that sense of accomplishment, like I said earlier, is one of the largest driving forces behind the series. You aren't just jumping from level to level or moving from boss to boss. You're struggling over every painstaking step you take, fighting your way to reach the bonfire, and thus resting for a moment, O weary traveler. Even the term bonfire has come to mean a moment of respite in an otherwise chaotic world in pop culture now. Asking how to beat certain bosses online has usually met with chiding "get good," telling you that the real destination in the game is the journey. So much of Souls-like games are about the promise of advancement through failure, which is a crucial life lesson if anything. "You died" are 2 words that, if you are not careful, will burn themselves onto your monitor lest you learn from your mistakes. And there's a rhythm to this type of game. You have to learn patience and not overexerting yourself when you think you've got things under control. That's always when the game punishes you the most. All these little morsels combine to make the perfect soup that you willfully slurp down every time you play. It's part of the intoxicating allure, the challenge, the lesson, and the eventual triumph. It's the hero's journey, and you don't even need to leave your couch. And that journey never ends. Typically, when you play a video game, you'll reach that moment of near godhood, when most things in the game are trivialized. Usually by your character's disgusting level, equipment, abilities, whatever it is. That is not the case in most Souls-like games. The strongest boss can kill you just as easily as the weakest skeleton, and these things blend together to make the true progression. Not that of your character, but of yourself in your own development. If you started the game with the best gear, sure, you might kill things faster, but if you aren't good, then you die just the same as if you started naked. Soulsborne games make you a better gamer, and that's something that has resonated with me and others throughout the rising fame of this genre. Games that I once found particularly hard are now easier for me to approach. Even with new games that come out, I don't fall into those frustrated moments where I just mutter to myself, I'll go look it up. I'm reminded that the game was built to be beaten, and I need to look or try harder. That's a discipline that has been honed in the fires of endlessly dying to the Bell Gargoyle in Dark Souls 1, or slamming my face against the Cleric Beast in Bloodborne. Furthermore, the replayability is behind that difficulty. Trying out different character builds, trying to beat the game with ridiculous harder parameters set upon yourself, whatever it is. If you do hard things, you learn how to deal with hardship better, in video games and in life. And if there's one thing I've learned in my years, it's that people love to overcome hard obstacles. There's a pride to it, and also you can brag about it. Which brings me to my final point about why these games are so successful: the community. Talking to someone about your triumphs in these games is one of the best feelings, unless it's your puzzled spouse who just wants you to pay the 3-month delinquent electric bill. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a certain badge, a literal real-life accomplishment that's unlocked when you beat any of the entries in this series. Regaling how you dealt with one boss easily, but another one took you days is different for everyone. Maybe you beat the Cleric Beast with ease and struggled with another that I one-shotted. Every experience is custom. This spawns a wide-spanning community across so many different mediums: cosplays, subreddits, online guilds, any number of ways people can talk about their journey in this universe. Even further, there's a direct community in the game, allowing you to leave little messages of warning or of encouragement to one another. This sort of disembodied sense of playing alongside people as you see their pale shades run alongside the very path you're tracing. Or perhaps it's the crimson-colored wraiths that reveal the death of another fellow adventurer. It's such an interesting online adjacent way of playing a video game that is just enchanting. Then there's, of course, the actual online portion of it, invading each other's worlds, attempting to slow another's progress by killing them, or even coming to the aid of someone who has been invaded, ramping the odds up in their favor as a defender of the meek. This strong sense of community is one of the biggest factors to the Soulsborne success story, in my opinion. You get to commiserate with people as you slog through the same horrible circumstances. If you've worked in retail, you probably worked way longer at a store because you were shoulder to shoulder with coworkers through all the shit you had to deal with. The same applies here. It's trauma bonding in the best way possible. With all this success, though, there will inevitably be ways that this leaks into the greater gaming industry, and the Souls-like genre has exploded in some direct ways and in some indirect ways into almost every major game that has come out. I mean, even the fact that we're talking about Souls-like as a genre or subgenre is evidence enough alone of its obvious effect on a wider scale. But let's really take a look at some of the more direct ways that we can see this genre coming to life. One of the easiest and newer games to come out is Jedi Fallen Order and its sequel, Jedi Survivor. Both of these games utilize a soul system to level up. Cal Kestis gathers experience over the course of his adventure, gaining ability points every time he fills up the experience bar. But you cannot use those experience points unless you visit the game's version of a bonfire, a Jedi meditation circle. If you die along the way, well, you have to run back to that point and hopefully kill the creature that killed you to regain all the lost progress. If you don't, then that experience is lost forever. Also, all those monsters respawn every time you rest or die. I've often remarked that Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor are a great entry into the genre without the crushing difficulty of a true Soulsborne. All the Souls games don't have a variable difficulty, whereas the Jedi games do, so you can cater it to how you want to approach it. Outside of the Jedi entries, you have some more direct clones, both Neo 1 and 2, which eschew a dark medieval fantasy world for a dark feudal Japanese one, mixing in the itemization of games like Diablo with varying item rarities. Want to take a dip into the romance of the Three Kingdoms as a Souls-like? Try playing Wo Long, which has lots of the same level and boss design mechanics of the From Software games. Looking for a more typical fantasy approach? Lords of the Fallen or Lords of the Fallen's relaunch are both games that borrow heavily from Dark Souls. Code Vein, Lies of P, Mortal Shell, Titan Souls, The Surge, there's really something for everyone depending upon what setting or theme you're looking for. But it's easy to draw those comparisons to games that are within the Souls-like genre. It's been so influential though that mechanics have leaked into other games or outright changed the scope of games. Take for example Darksiders 1. It plays like a God of War style of action game. Darksiders 2 plays more like a Zelda, but Darksiders 3 sidesteps the entire series and turns into a Souls-like in an attempt to appeal to a wider audience. Death Stranding borrows the messaging system present in the Souls series to help Daryl make his many deliveries across the wasteland. That same messaging system is actually what inspired the director of Dragon's Dogma to create the Pawn system. He was looking for a way to create the sense of indirect community you got from message boards and forums in the early days of the internet. And after seeing the messaging system in Demon Souls, he then creates the Pawn system as his answer. The concept of a bonfire is not entirely new in the sense that plenty of games have safe rooms, especially if you've played any Castlevania game. But Evil Within, a horror game, uses a lot of the themes of the roguelike experience that Souls games deliver. But as you wind through the twisted corridors of that cursed game, you'll hear a distant Clair de Lune playing, telling your character you're near a safe place. But much like seeing a bonfire off in the distance, that can lead to these moments of being a little lax. And it's often when the game throws the hardest shit your way. Truth be told though, Evil Within is more like Resident Evil 4 than anything, but you can see that thread I'm weaving by toying with the player's sense of ease. The first and second Remnant games are another example of a genre-jumping influence. You're playing a third-person shooter Dark Souls through and through, complete with vague story and quest characters you might inadvertently kill by just simply playing and letting too much time go by. Dead Cells and Blasphemous are two excellent examples of games that borrow heavily from the Souls-like advancement system, and both being roguelike games as well. And Metroidvanias. Remember what I said earlier about a million descriptors? It's annoying, right? Blasphemous is also like playing a straight-up 2D side-scroller of Dark Souls, from the level and boss design all the way down to the customization. Now, of course, Call of Duty isn't out there making you spend souls to upgrade your guns, sure, but a lot of the major titles that are coming out from AAA studios are borrowing things from this genre. Soon, we'll see this amalgamation blend in the same way we have for RPGs. RPGs are so much less of a genre now than an adjective or a series of mechanics that have been imbued into almost every game. We see it already in the latter entries in the Assassin's Creed games. God of War and God of War Ragnarok are amazing examples of games that stay true to their prime DNA, but whenever you do one of those Valkyrie fights, you can catch that sharp whiff of Souls-like influence. So maybe it's not directly ripping mechanics off, but it's more the rising tide across the industry that has answered the call of harder games. Maybe it's the timing and reaction-based gaming of the Souls series. Maybe it's just the design methodology. Whatever it is, the Soulsborne series has improved gaming as a whole, and in my opinion, for the better. Now, you might not fully agree with me on this sentiment. That's fine. That's the point of an op-ed piece after all. But I think we can all agree that the lasting effect that we see brought across many games stems from a desire to go back to the roots of gaming, where games were difficult. Now, games were difficult for different reasons in the 80s and 90s, and that has to do with a whole video's worth of issues. So let me know in the comments below if you're interested in that. But the lifeblood of the Souls series has touched every corner of the gaming industry, from its self-named genre to horror, action, shooters, and plenty of other games across the cosmos of your ever-growing Steam library. If you've never touched a Souls game and your feed is filled with videos about Elden RIng, or maybe your friends won't shut up about it, perhaps it's time to take a journey. You won't be the same gamer you were when you started, but you'll certainly become a better gamer, and you'll earn a place among the lauded millions that have come before you, the vast community of sometimes toxic, but otherwise wholesome travelers, of hunters, tarnished, and chosen undead. The real question is, are you ready to praise the sun? Thank you so much for watching today, guys. This is part of a new direction I'm taking with the channel where we discuss fun questions in both game lore and history. So you can go ahead and let me know if there are any subjects you'd like me to discuss in the comment section below. Also, if you're enjoying this format, please let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Each one of those things is free and helps me out a ton, while also supplying endless treats to Roman, my mini Australian crackhead. If you want to support the channel, please consider becoming a member, as even the lowest member makes my life far easier. But as always, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.